My husband insisted on an open relationship to explore his options, but he completely lost his mind and broke down in tears when I decided to sleep with his best friend. My name is Valerie, and at 33 years old, I thought I was standing on the solid ground of a life well built. But as it turns out, I was just building a sandcastle while the tide was coming in. I remember sitting in that bridal boutique, looking at myself in a dress that cost $4,000, feeling like every struggle of the last 8 years had been worth it. Harrison was the man I was going to marry. We had been together since we were 25, through the lean years, the hungry years, and finally, the successful years. Or at least, his successful years. Looking back, the signs of the fracture were there, hidden under the layers of our shared history. You see, I wasn't just Harrison's fiancée, I was his foundation. When he wanted to quit his stable job to start that tech company, I was the one who said go for it. For 3 long years, I worked double shifts at a soul-crushing corporate insurance office, coming home with my eyes burning from staring at spreadsheets just so we could keep the lights on while he coded in our basement. I didn't mind the ramen noodles or the missed vacations because I believed in us. I believed in the team we were. I'll never forget the winter of our 3rd year together. Harrison's mother needed hip surgery, and his startup hadn't made a single cent of profit yet. He was devastated, sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. I didn't hesitate. I went to the safe deposit box and took out the sapphire necklace my grandmother had left me. It was the only thing of real value I owned, a beautiful piece of jewelry that had survived 2 wars and a Great Depression. I sold it for $7,500 the next morning and handed him the cashier's check. I told him it was just a piece of metal, and his mother's health was what mattered. He cried and promised he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me. For a long time, it felt like he meant it. As his company took off and the money started flowing in, we moved into a beautiful 3-bedroom apartment downtown. We started eating at restaurants where the wine list was longer than my insurance manuals. We got engaged, and for a while, I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. I thought our love was an absolute truth, something that didn't need to be questioned. But Harrison had started spending more time at the gym and less time talking to me. He started buying tailored suits and obsessing over his reflection in the mirror. Success hadn't just changed our bank account, it had started to change the way he saw himself and, more importantly, the way he saw me. He stopped seeing the woman who sacrificed everything for him and started seeing me as a relic of his past, a reminder of the time when he was struggling and small. The real trouble started when Silas came back into the picture. Silas had been Harrison's best friend since they were kids, the kind of bond that usually outlasts everything. But Silas had just gone through a brutal divorce. His wife had left him for a younger man, and Silas had spent 6 months in a dark hole before suddenly emerging as a completely different person. He had lost 30 pounds, traded his minivan for a sleek black sports car, and was constantly surrounded by different women every weekend. He looked like he was 25 again, living the kind of bachelor life that Harrison had completely bypassed because he was busy building a company with me. Harrison became fascinated with Silas's new lifestyle. They started having their weekly guys' nights, which turned into late-night drinking sessions and weekend trips that I wasn't invited to. When Harrison would stumble home at 2 o'clock in the morning, smelling like expensive scotch and cigars, he had this glazed look in his eyes. He wasn't just tired, he was wondering. I could see the wheels turning in his head. One night, as I was sitting on the edge of the bed waiting for him, he stopped in front of the full-length mirror and sighed. He asked me if I ever wondered if we were together because we actually wanted to be, or just because we had been together for 8 years and didn't know how to stop. That question felt like a slap in the face. I told him that I was with him because I loved him, because we had built a life together from nothing. But Harrison just shook his head and said that he felt like he had missed a vital stage of being a man. He said he looked at Silas and saw someone who was truly alive, someone who was experiencing the world instead of just fulfilling an obligation. I tried to tell him that Silas was hurting, that his lifestyle was a reaction to a painful betrayal, but Harrison wasn't listening. He was too busy looking at the gray hairs in his sideburns and wondering what else was out there. The dinners at home became silent and heavy. I would spend an hour cooking a beautiful meal, and he would spend the whole time staring at his phone, probably looking at Silas's social media posts of beach parties and rooftop bars. He started making little comments about my appearance too. Nothing direct, but he'd mention how fit the women at Silas's gym were, or how he missed the spontaneous energy we had when we were younger. It was like he was trying to justify his growing boredom by making it my fault. I felt like I was losing him an inch at a time, and the harder I tried to hold on, the further he drifted toward the edge of the world he shared with Silas. As we hit the 3-month mark before the wedding, Harrison's distance turned into a cold, clinical detachment. He started bringing home books on evolutionary psychology and articles about the myth of lifelong monogamy. He would read aloud from his phone while I was trying to watch a movie, talking about how humans weren't designed to be with one person for decades. He called our relationship stagnant water, saying that even the best relationships need movement to stay fresh. I remember sitting there with a knot in my stomach, listening to him talk about us like we were a laboratory experiment instead of a couple who had shared a bed for 8 years. He told me about a study he'd found that claimed couples who explored other connections before marriage had a 30% higher satisfaction rate in the long run. I asked him where he was getting this sudden interest in statistics, and he just shrugged and said he wanted us to have the strongest marriage possible. But his eyes were cold. There was no warmth when he looked at me anymore. He started comparing our relationship to a comfortable old sweater that you keep in the back of the closet but never wear out because it's not exciting anymore. He told me that he didn't want to wake up at 50 years old and wonder what he had missed. I felt my self-esteem crumbling under the weight of his words. Every sacrifice I had made, every double shift I had worked, every dream I had put on hold to support him was being dismissed as just a habit. I felt like a fool for believing that loyalty was a currency that would always hold its value. Harrison was looking at our 8 years together as a sunk cost, something he had already paid for and was now bored with. He was looking for a way out without having to be the bad guy who walked away from the woman who saved him. He started dropping hints about conscious choice, saying that a choice isn't real unless you have other options to compare it to. He told me that since we had been together since we were 25, we hadn't really chosen each other in the real world. We had just grown together in a vacuum. I tried to argue that growing together was the whole point, that building a history was what made a relationship meaningful, but he just dismissed my feelings as emotional reasoning. He wanted logic, he wanted data, and most of all, he wanted permission to be the man he saw in Silas's reflection. The tension in our apartment was so thick you could feel it on your skin, a silent countdown to the moment when the ground would finally give way under my feet. It happened on a Tuesday evening, exactly 8 weeks before our wedding date. The invitations had already been mailed out. The florist had been paid a deposit of $1,500. My parents had already booked their flights from across the country. We were sitting at the kitchen table, and I had made a meatloaf, his favorite comfort food. But Harrison didn't even pick up his fork. He set his phone face down on the table and looked at me with a level of seriousness that made my heart stop. He said he had been thinking a lot about our future, and he had come to a conclusion. He said he wanted us to try an open relationship for 3 months. I remember the room spinning. I thought he was joking, but his face was like stone. He explained that this wasn't about him wanting to leave me, it was about validation. He said he wanted to make sure that when he stood at that altar in 2 months, he was doing it because I was the absolute best woman for him, not just the only woman he knew. He called it a temporary exploration phase. He said we would be completely honest with each other, we would use protection, and we would come back together after 90 days to decide if we still wanted to move forward with the marriage. Then the gaslighting began. When I started to cry, he didn't reach out to comfort me. He just sighed and said that my emotional reaction was exactly why we needed this. He told me that I was being possessive and insecure, and that my fear was a sign that our foundation was weak. He said that if our love was as strong as I claimed it was, it should be able to survive a few months of outside connection. He told me that by trying to stop him, I was stifling his growth as an individual. He made me feel like the villain of the story because I wanted to be the only woman he slept with 2 months before our wedding. He used all the modern therapy terms he'd learned from his podcasts. He talked about ethical non-monogamy and decentering the ego. He told me that he had already discussed this with Silas, and Silas had agreed that it was a very mature way to handle pre-wedding jitters. That stung the most, knowing he had talked to his friend about our intimacy before he had even talked to me. He told me that if I truly loved him, I would want him to be happy and certain. He framed his infidelity as a gift to our future marriage, a way to clear the air so he wouldn't have any regrets when we were older. I sat there, staring at the cooling meatloaf, feeling like the man I loved had been replaced by a cold, calculating stranger who was using my own devotion to trap me. I didn't sleep for 3 nights. I stayed in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, trying to wrap my head around the impossible choice he had given me. If I said no, I knew Harrison would resent me forever. He would always wonder about the women he didn't meet and the experiences he didn't have. He would look at me every day and see a cage instead of a partner. But if I said yes, I would have to endure the agony of knowing my fiancé was in the arms of other women while I waited at home like a loyal dog. I felt like I was being asked to set myself on fire to keep him warm. The pressure from the outside world was suffocating. My mother called me that Friday, all excited because she had found the perfect shoes for the wedding. She talked about how happy she was that I had found a man as stable and successful as Harrison. I couldn't tell her the truth. I couldn't tell her that the stable man she admired was currently looking for dates on his phone in the next room. The thought of the shame, the canceled venue, the 200 guests who would have to be told the wedding was off, it was too much. I felt like I was being crushed by the weight of 8 years of expectations. I went back into our bedroom on the 4th morning. Harrison was already up, checking his emails and looking perfectly refreshed, as if he hadn't just blown up my entire world. I told him I would agree to his experiment, but only if he promised it would only be for 3 months and that we would have total transparency. I saw a spark of excitement in his eyes that I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't the excitement of a man who loved me. It was the excitement of a hunter who had just been let off the leash. He hugged me and told me I was the most amazing, evolved woman he had ever known. The praise felt like ash in my mouth. He insisted on setting ground rules. We would both be free to date and sleep with other people. We wouldn't bring anyone to the apartment. We would be home by midnight unless we texted otherwise. And we would check in every Sunday to process our feelings. He made it sound so organized, so clinical. Like we were managing a business merger instead of a marriage. I agreed to everything, nodding like a doll, while my heart was screaming. I was so terrified of losing him that I was willing to lose myself. I told myself it was just a phase, a temporary madness brought on by the pressure of the wedding. I thought that if I was patient and loving, he would realize that no one could ever love him the way I did. I was so wrong. The change in Harrison was instantaneous and horrifying. Within 48 hours of our agreement, he had downloaded 4 different dating apps. He spent $300 on a new set of silk bedsheets for his own space, and another $200 on a high-end cologne that smelled like bergamot and arrogance. He got a modern, aggressive haircut that made him look younger and sharper. Every morning, I would hear him whistling in the shower, a happy, upbeat tune that made me want to scream. He hadn't whistled like that in years. He wasn't whistling for me. He was whistling for the possibilities that lay ahead of him. He became obsessed with his phone. He would sit on the sofa next to me, but he was miles away, his thumb constantly swiping right, his face lit up by the blue light of the screen. Sometimes he would even chuckle at a message he received, and then look at me and apologize, saying he was just making connections. He started going to the gym for 2 hours every day, working on his physique with a desperation that was pathetic to watch. He wanted to be the perfect specimen for the women he hadn't met yet. He was 40 years old acting like he was 21, and he didn't care how much it hurt me to watch. The first night he went out on a date, I thought I was going to die. He spent an hour getting ready, trying on 3 different shirts before settling on a navy blue one that I had bought him for his birthday. He checked his reflection in the hallway mirror, straightened his collar, and told me not to wait up. He said he was meeting a very interesting artist for drinks downtown. When the door clicked shut behind him, the silence in the apartment was deafening. I sat on the floor in the dark living room and just listened to the clock on the mantel. Tick, tick, tick. Every second was a reminder that he was with someone else, looking at them with the eyes that used to belong to me. He didn't come home until 3 o'clock in the morning. I was still on the sofa, unable to move, unable to even turn on the lights. He walked in, smelling of that new cologne and a faint hint of floral perfume that wasn't mine. He looked energized, his eyes bright in the darkness. He didn't even ask if I was okay. He just told me that he had a fascinating conversation and that he felt more alive than he had in months. He went straight to the shower, singing to himself, while I sat there in the dark, feeling like a ghost in my own home. I realized then that Harrison wasn't trying to strengthen our marriage. He was trying to replace it. He was building a new life, and I was just the safety net he was keeping around in case he fell. Before we continue with this intense journey, if you're finding value in this story, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave a comment below with the name of the city you are watching from. Every single comment helps this video reach more people who need to hear it. Thank you so much for your support. By the second week of the experiment, Harrison had established what he called a rotation. He wasn't just dating, he was managing a schedule. There were 3 women he saw regularly. First, there was Clara, the 26-year-old photographer who lived in a loft downtown. Harrison talked about her raw, creative energy as if it were a spiritual revelation. He said she saw the world in a way he never had. Then there was Fiona, a 30-year-old marketing executive who was sharp as a razor and challenged his business ideas. And finally, there was Ruby, a yoga instructor who taught him about mindfulness and being present. I had to listen to all of it. During our Sunday processing sessions, he would sit across from me and describe these women in agonizing detail. He told me how Clara's apartment smelled like oil paint and incense. He told me how Fiona's ambition made him feel powerful. He told me how Ruby's touch was healing. Every word was a knife in my chest. He used words to describe them that he hadn't used for me in half a decade. I was no longer the woman who had saved his company or sold her grandmother's necklace. I was just the stable partner who was expected to listen to his adventures with a supportive smile. He was falling in love with the novelty of these women, and he was doing it right in front of my face. While Harrison was treating our engagement like a buffet, I felt like I was starving in a room full of plastic food. 2 months into this experiment, the guilt and the isolation had become a physical weight in my chest. Every time I walked past the guest room where Harrison now kept his dating wardrobe, I felt a wave of nausea. But Harrison kept pushing me. During one of our Sunday sessions, he actually had the nerve to tell me I was being too picky. He said the point was to experience different types of people, not to find a soulmate. He suggested I reach out to a colleague's brother, a man named Preston. I finally agreed, mostly just to stop Harrison from lecturing me about my closed mindset. Preston was objectively a great catch. He was 35 years old, a successful architect with a kind smile and a gentle way of speaking. We met at a high-end Italian restaurant downtown. The atmosphere was perfect, dim lighting, soft jazz, and the smell of toasted garlic and expensive red wine. Preston was charming. He asked me about my life, my interests, and he actually listened when I spoke. But as I sat across from him, all I could think about was how his laugh wasn't familiar. I kept looking at his hands and thinking about how they weren't the hands that had held mine for 8 years. The conversation was agonizingly polite. Preston talked about his recent projects and his love for mid-century modern design. Under any other circumstances, I would have been fascinated. But I felt like a fraud. I was wearing my engagement ring on my left hand, tucked under the table like a dirty secret. I felt like I was betraying something sacred, even though my fiancé was probably at that very moment laughing in a loft with a 26-year-old photographer. I realized that for Harrison, sex was just an activity, like tennis or a business meeting. But for me, intimacy was tied to history. It was tied to those 8 years of shared jokes, silent understandings, and the sapphire necklace I had sold to save his mother. When Preston walked me to my car at the end of the night, there was a long, awkward silence. He leaned in and tried to kiss me goodnight. I let him. His lips were soft, and he was careful, but I felt absolutely nothing. No spark, no heat, just a deep, hollow emptiness. It was like watching a movie of someone else's life. I drove home in tears, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. When I walked into the apartment, Harrison was already in bed, staring at his phone and smiling. He asked how the date went without even looking up. I told him it was fine, and he just nodded, his thumb already swiping onto the next profile. He didn't want me to find someone. He just wanted me to be busy so he didn't have to feel guilty. The turning point happened on a Tuesday afternoon. It was a miserable, rainy day, the kind where the sky is the color of wet concrete and the wind cuts right through your coat. I had taken the afternoon off because I couldn't focus on my spreadsheets anymore. I ducked into a small, quiet cafe near the park to get out of the rain. I was sitting in a corner booth, nursing a lukewarm tea, when I saw a familiar figure enter. It was Silas. He looked damp and slightly frazzled, but when he saw me, his entire face transformed. He didn't just wave, he walked over with a look of genuine concern. "Valerie," he said, pulling out the chair opposite me without even asking. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. How are you really doing with all this madness?" I hadn't talked to Silas properly in months. In my mind, he was the one who had started all of this, the ghost of the bachelor life that Harrison was trying so hard to emulate. But as I looked at him, I didn't see a predatory playboy. I saw a man who looked deeply regretful. I ended up pouring it all out, the loneliness, the 3 women Harrison was rotating through, the date with Preston that felt like a funeral. While I was talking, the waitress came by to take our order. Silas didn't even look at the menu. He ordered a black coffee for himself and a hot chocolate with extra foam for me. Then he added, "And please make sure there are no almond shavings or almond milk near that hot chocolate. She has a severe allergy." I froze. I hadn't told Silas about my almond allergy in years. It was a random detail I had mentioned once at a New Year's Eve party 4 years ago. Harrison, the man I lived with, had forgotten it twice in the last year, even buying me a box of almond croissants for my birthday by mistake. "You remembered that?" I whispered. Silas looked down at his hands, looking almost embarrassed. "I remember a lot of things about you, Valerie," he said quietly. He told me that he had been watching Harrison take me for granted for a long time. He confessed that he had talked to Harrison about the freedom of being single, but he never intended for Harrison to use that information to hurt me. He said Harrison was an idiot for not realizing that he already had the prize. For the first time in 8 years, someone wasn't looking at me as Harrison's stable partner. Someone was looking at me as a woman who was worth remembering. The rain kept drumming against the window, but for the first hour in months, the cold inside my chest started to thaw. After that day at the cafe, everything began to shift. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, steady burn. Silas and I started texting. It began with him checking in to see if I was okay, but it quickly turned into long, deep conversations that lasted well into the night. While Harrison was out with Clara or Fiona, I was tucked under a blanket on the sofa, my phone glowing with messages from Silas. He asked me questions that Harrison hadn't asked in years. He wanted to know about my dreams for my interior design studio, the one I had put on hold to pay for Harrison's startup. He wanted to know what books I was reading and what I thought about the world. I realized I was experiencing a different kind of open relationship. Harrison was out there collecting bodies and experiences, but I was finding an emotional connection that was far more dangerous. Silas became my safe harbor. When Harrison would come home and brag about how inspiring Clara's photography was, I would think about how Silas had spent an hour the night before listening to me explain the color theory behind my latest project. Silas told me I was intelligent, beautiful, and talented. He made me feel like my thoughts mattered, that my presence in a room was a gift rather than a given. The contrast was devastating. Harrison was falling in love with the novelty of new women, but Silas was falling in love with me as I actually was. I remember one specific evening when Harrison was late coming back from a date with Ruby. He texted me saying he was staying late to meditate. I knew what that meant. I was sitting on the balcony, feeling that familiar sting of rejection, when a message from Silas popped up. It was a photo of a sunset he had seen on his way home. The caption said, "This made me think of that painting you described. I wish you were here to see it with me." I realized then that I wasn't just a backup plan for Silas. To him, I was the main event. He started noticing the tiny things Harrison had long since stopped seeing. He noticed when I changed my hair, even if it was just a slight trim. He noticed when I was stressed before a big meeting at work. He even remembered the names of my childhood pets. I felt like I was being seen in high definition after years of living in a blur. The guilt of talking to my fiancé's best friend was there, but it was being drowned out by the sheer intoxicating feeling of being valued. I wasn't furniture anymore. I was a person again. The tension between Silas and me finally broke on a Friday night, 3 weeks before the experiment was supposed to end. Harrison was away for the weekend on a creative retreat with Clara in the mountains. I was alone in the apartment, surrounded by the silence of a life that no longer felt like mine. Silas called and asked if I wanted to come over for dinner. He said he had bought a bottle of that rare Italian wine I had mentioned during our date with Preston. I knew what going over there meant. I knew that by stepping through his door, I was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. When I arrived at his apartment, the atmosphere was thick with everything we hadn't said. Silas had cooked a beautiful meal, 3 courses, all of my favorite things. He hadn't asked what I wanted. He had just remembered from our countless conversations. As we sat on his balcony, the city lights twinkling like diamonds below us, the air felt electric. Silas set down his glass and looked at me with an intensity that made my breath hitch. He told me that he couldn't pretend anymore. He said that watching Harrison treat me like an option while he was off playing the field made him sick. He told me that he had wanted to kiss me since that party 3 years ago, when I was wearing a blue dress and Harrison was too busy checking his phone to notice how incredible I looked. "I'm falling for you, Valerie," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. I know the timing is a disaster. I know he's my friend. But I can't stay quiet and watch him lose you because he's too blind to see what he has. He reached out and touched my face, his thumb tracing my jawline. I didn't pull away. For the first time in years, I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated desire. I wasn't thinking about the 8 years of history or the 200 wedding invitations. I was thinking about the man standing in front of me who saw my worth without needing a 3-month test to prove it. When he kissed me, it wasn't like the kiss with Preston. It was a revelation. It was passionate, intense, and completely present. It was the sound of 1,000 doors slamming shut and one big door swinging open. That night, I didn't feel like I was betraying Harrison. I felt like I was finally being loyal to myself. We spent the night together, and for the first time in a decade, I didn't feel like I had to perform or be the stable one. Silas held me like I was the most precious thing in the world. As I lay in his bed, watching the sun come up over the city, I realized that my life with Harrison was over. I wasn't going back to being a safety net. I was moving forward into a world where I was the first choice. The end came on a Tuesday, exactly 90 days after the experiment had begun. Harrison had returned from his retreat with Clara, looking smug and refreshed. He sat on the sofa, his feet up on the coffee table, and told me that he had found his clarity. He said that while Clara was amazing, he had realized that I was the one he wanted to build a home base with. He actually had the audacity to say that the experiment had been a success because it had reconfirmed his commitment to me. He spoke as if he were delivering a quarterly earnings report, completely oblivious to the fact that I was already gone. I let him finish. I sat in the armchair opposite him, my hands folded in my lap, feeling a strange, icy calm. Then I told him that I had also found clarity. I told him that I had been seeing someone regularly for the past month. Harrison chuckled, a patronizing sound that made my skin crawl. He asked, "Oh yeah? Who's the lucky guy?" Is it that architect, Preston? I looked him straight in the eye and said, No, Harrison. It's Silas. The silence that followed was deafening. The phone in Harrison's hand slipped and clattered onto the hardwood floor. His face went from smug to pale, then to a deep, angry red. He stood up so fast he knocked over his water glass. What did you say? He hissed. I repeated it. I told him that while he was off exploring Clara's creative energy, I was finding a real connection with his best friend. Harrison began to pace the room, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He started screaming that this wasn't what the agreement was about. He said that Silas was his friend, and that friends don't do that to each other. The meltdown was catastrophic. He picked up a decorative vase, one we had bought together on our 5th anniversary, and hurled it against the wall, where it shattered into 1,000 pieces. He fell to his knees in the middle of the living room, sobbing hysterically, begging me to tell him I was joking. He accused me of being malicious and calculating, saying I had chosen the one person who could hurt him most. I stood up and looked down at him, feeling no pity, only a profound sense of justice. I told him, You told me to explore other connections, Harrison. I did exactly what you asked. I just didn't expect to find a better option while you were looking. 10 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. It was Silas. He was there to help me pack. When he walked into the living room and saw Harrison on the floor, the tension in the room doubled. Harrison scrambled to his feet, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He lunged toward Silas, calling him a traitor and a snake. Silas didn't flinch. He just stepped in front of me, a protective barrier that I didn't even have to ask for. Harrison started screaming about codes and loyalty, accusing Silas of engineering the whole situation to steal his fiancée. Silas remained perfectly calm, his voice low and steady. He told Harrison, I didn't steal anything, Harrison. You made her available. You spent 3 months making the woman you supposedly loved feel like she wasn't enough for you. He pointed out that Harrison had been dating 3 women at once while expecting Valerie to wait around as his backup plan. Silas said, You didn't want a partner, you wanted a possession. You're only angry now because you lost the one thing you thought was a sure thing. Harrison turned to me, his voice cracking with desperation. He begged me to call off the wedding, to postpone everything so we could work through this. He said he loved me, but I finally saw that word for what it was in his mouth, a tether. I told him, You love the security of me, Harrison. You don't love me. If you loved me, you wouldn't have needed to sleep with 3 other women to realize my worth. I walked into the bedroom, grabbed the 2 suitcases I had already packed, and came back to the kitchen counter. I took off the $4,000 engagement ring and set it down next to the cold, broken glass on the floor. I looked at the man I had spent 8 years with and realized I didn't even recognize him anymore. I walked out of that apartment with Silas, leaving Harrison alone in the wreckage of the life he thought he could always come back to. 6 months later, the dust had finally settled. The wedding was officially canceled, and the deposits for the venue and the caterer, over $5,000 in total, were lost forever. My parents were disappointed, and some of our mutual friends took sides, but I didn't care. I had moved into a small, sun-drenched studio of my own and finally started the interior design business I had dreamed of for a decade. Harrison had tried to make it work with Clara, but according to mutual friends, that relationship had fizzled out within 2 months. Without the thrill of the experiment and the safety net of our relationship, Harrison had realized that Clara was just a stranger with a camera, and he was just a middle-aged man with a deep sense of regret. I ran into Harrison one final time at a bookstore downtown a year after I left him. He looked older, tired, and the cocky energy he had during his exploration phase was completely gone. He told me that he had made a mistake, that he had thrown away something real for a shadow. He asked if we could try again, now that he was sure. I looked at him and felt a strange sense of pity, but no desire to return. I told him, Harrison, you didn't lose me. You gave me away. And I'm finally with someone who doesn't need to shop around to know I'm the prize. Today, Silas and I are engaged. He proposed on a quiet Sunday morning while we were painting my new studio. There were no grand gestures, no tests, and no data points. Just a man who has chosen me every single day since the moment he remembered my almond allergy 4 years ago. I learned the hard way that love isn't a sunk cost or a habit. It's a continuous choice. I'm grateful for Harrison's experiment, not because it strengthened our marriage, but because it forced me to see that I was settling for being a secondary character in my own life. I finally stepped into the lead role, and I'm never going back. Am I wrong for taking his rules literally and finding my worth in the arms of his best friend? Or did he meticulously orchestrate his own absolute destruction? Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button to support the channel and stay updated on more stories like this.